Hello, my dear ones. Let's start the story, and in the meantime, please subscribe so you don't forget me. I love you all.
Harold Jennings was 63 the night his world split open. He was a man of quiet routines, the sort who found comfort in small things: the worn leather recliner in the living room, the faint buzz of a ball game drifting from the television, the smell of coffee cooling on the end table. The Jennings home was not grand, not poor either, just steady, a two-story house with creaking stairs and wallpaper chosen 30 years ago that had never been replaced. His wife, Margaret, still kept the kitchen spotless, and she had her favorite porcelain figurines lined up above the mantel. They had a son, Daniel, grown now, 33 years old, living just a few blocks away. Life had slowed for Harold since retirement. He still did a bit of carpentry for neighbors, kept the garden tidy, and fixed whatever broke around the house. It was a life of habit. He thought he knew every corner of it. But habits, as he was about to learn, can mask rot that lies beneath. It was late, close to midnight, when Margaret chose to speak. She had been restless all evening, fidgeting with her napkin at dinner, leaving her plate half-eaten. Harold noticed, he always noticed, but he didn't press. He thought perhaps she was tired, or had one of those small worries she sometimes carried, the kind that passed by morning. When they sat together in the living room, she kept shifting in her chair, smoothing her skirt again and again. Finally, she spoke his name softly. Harold. He looked up. The ballgame hummed in the background. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. The tone alone chilled him. It wasn't ordinary worry. It wasn't about the bills, or the plumbing, or her sister's health. It was something heavier. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his glass. She hesitated, biting her lip, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles whitened. And then, after a pause that stretched too long, she said it. 30 years ago. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." The words came haltingly, as though dragged from her throat. Harold frowned, leaning forward. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes darted toward the floor. She could not look at him. "It was your father. It happened once, when you were working long hours. I've carried it all these years. I couldn't keep it in anymore." The air collapsed out of Harold's chest. For a moment he thought he hadn't heard correctly, that his ears had twisted the words. But she went on, filling the silence with broken sentences, fragments of explanation that only deepened the wound. It had been so long ago. She had hated herself since. She had thought it best to keep quiet, to bury it, to protect their marriage, to protect him. But there it was. His wife had lain with his own father. Harold sat frozen. His hands, once so steady, trembled against his knees. His father, dead now 15 years, had been a strict man, proud, controlling, the kind who never gave Harold approval. And now, from the grave, he had stolen something more, something Harold could never reclaim. Margaret wept. "I'm sorry, Harold. I should have told you sooner. I don't expect forgiveness. I just couldn't hold it anymore." But Harold gave no reply. His face was blank, eyes fixed on nothing. When morning came, Harold hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood. Margaret moved quietly, making coffee, her eyes swollen from tears. She tried to speak once, but his silence stopped her. At 9 o'clock, he rose, took his jacket from the chair, and left the house. He walked the 3 blocks to his son's home. Daniel lived in a modest 2-bedroom with bare walls and stacks of books and papers. He was a solitary man, 33, unmarried, never close to his mother. Daniel opened the door, surprised. "Dad? You look like hell. What happened?" Harold stepped inside, sat heavily on the couch, and told him everything. Every word Margaret had said. Daniel listened, arms crossed, jaw tightening as the story went on. There was no shock in his eyes, only something colder, like confirmation of a suspicion he had carried for years. "So that's who she really is," he said finally, his voice sharp. "And you've lived with her all this time." "I didn't know," Harold whispered. Daniel paced the room. You know, I never loved her. She wasn't a mother to me. Always critical, always cold. And now this. He turned suddenly, his eyes blazing. You can't just let it go. She doesn't get to walk away with 30 years of silence. Harold said nothing, but his son went on. We'll make her regret it. Both of us. She thinks confession bought her peace. We'll give her the opposite. The pact. That night, father and son sat together at Daniel's kitchen table. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke, though Harold hadn't smoked in years. This isn't just about what she did to you, Daniel said. It's about what she took from me too. A family. A mother who cared. She's owed us both a debt. And now we'll collect. Harold looked down at his hands scarred from decades of carpentry. He was not a man of schemes. But the anger inside him was sharp, raw, and it had nowhere else to go. Slowly he nodded. What do you propose? He asked. Daniel leaned in, his voice low. We start small. Make her nervous. Let her feel the ground shift under her feet. Secrets, silences, doubts. And then, his eyes narrowed. Then we take away everything she thinks she has left. The pact was sealed in silence. The Jennings house changed. At breakfast, Harold barely spoke. Daniel visited often, whispering with his father in the other room, letting the conversations fall silent when Margaret entered. She grew uneasy, her eyes darting between them, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. Are you two hiding something? She asked once. Daniel only smiled faintly. Maybe. At night, Harold heard her crying in the bedroom. He lay awake beside her, eyes open, listening, saying nothing. One evening, she confronted him outright. You're planning something, Harold. I can feel it. Please, if you're going to leave me, say it now. But Harold only stood, put on his jacket, and walked out without a word. The silence was worse than shouting. She grew frantic, pacing the house, checking drawers, listening at doors. She began to look smaller, her once careful hair unkempt, her clothes wrinkled. The son was right, she was breaking. And yet it was only the beginning. Because revenge, my boy, is not a single blow. It is a storm built piece by piece, until the victim no longer knows which way the wind will strike next. And Harold and Daniel had only just raised the first clouds. The Jennings home had always been a quiet place. The sort of quiet built on habit, Margaret humming softly as she cooked, Harold flipping through his evening paper, the clock in the hall marking time with steady ticks. But now the quiet was something else entirely. It was the hush of suspicion, of dread, of two men plotting under the same roof as the woman they meant to destroy. Daniel was the mind of it. He was sharp, watchful, the kind of man who saw weakness like a hawk sees movement in grass. She's unraveling already, he told his father one night in the garage, the single bulb casting their shadows long on the concrete. All we have to do is feed the doubt. Make her question what's real, what's imagined. Harold stood by the workbench, running his finger along a strip of sandpaper. He wasn't sure how far he wanted to go. But every time he thought of his wife's words, your father, the hesitation hardened into resolve. What do you have in mind? He asked. Daniel smiled. We let her hear things. Not everything. Just enough to make her wonder. It began subtly. When Margaret walked into a room, Harold and Daniel would stop their conversation mid-sentence. They didn't look startled, only deliberate, as though she had interrupted something important. Then they would exchange a glance and leave the room together. The first few times she tried to brush it off. But within a week she was asking, "What are you two talking about all the time?" "Nothing," Harold said flatly. Her eyes narrowed. "It's not nothing. You've both been whispering behind my back." Daniel gave a thin smile. "If it bothers you, maybe that says something." She flinched, and that small victory thrilled him. Daniel insisted on adding a prop. He convinced his father to clear out the bottom drawer of his old desk and keep it locked, jingling the key now and then in his pocket. Inside there was nothing but an old envelope stuffed with blank paper. Margaret noticed it within days. She tried to open it once while Harold showered, but the lock held. Later that night she asked casually, "What's in that drawer of yours?" "Just receipts," Harold answered. She studied his face, knowing he was lying. "Then why lock it?" "Because I want to," he said, and turned back to his newspaper. Her jaw tightened. She said nothing more, but Harold saw her testing the keyholes at night when she thought he slept. Life's ordinary rhythms began to crack. Margaret's hands shook while chopping vegetables. She left laundry half-folded. Once, she forgot to turn off the oven, filling the house with smoke. She muttered to herself when she thought she was alone. At meals, Harold barely touched his food. Daniel, visiting more often than ever, asked pointed questions just to unsettle her. "Funny thing," he said once, spearing a piece of chicken. "Do you ever wonder what secrets do to a person's soul after so many years?" Margaret froze, the fork trembling in her hand. "What are you trying to say?" Daniel smiled. "Just thinking out loud." 2 weeks into their silent campaign, Margaret broke. She cornered Harold in the kitchen late at night, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice hoarse. "I can't take this anymore. You're planning something, both of you. I see the way you look at me." Harold set down his glass and looked at her evenly. "You confess, Margaret. What did you expect? A hug? Forgiveness?" Her lip quivered. "It was 30 years ago. I thought." "You thought wrong," he snapped, his voice louder than it had been in weeks. She recoiled as though struck. From the doorway, Daniel watched silently, his eyes glittering. When Harold left the room, his son stepped forward. "You've destroyed yourself, Mother. All we're doing is letting you see it." Margaret began to avoid them. She stayed in the bedroom for hours, curtains drawn, emerging only to cook half-hearted meals. She made phone calls to her sister, to a friend across town, but she spoke in vague tones, never explaining fully what was happening. Daniel encouraged the isolation. He took her car keys one evening and slipped them into his pocket, letting her tear the house apart for hours before returning them silently to the counter. "She's losing her grip," he whispered to his father. "Good. That's what we want." Harold nodded, but a heaviness pulled at him. He saw the way her shoulders hunched, the way her hands shook even when she held nothing. Once, late at night, he caught her staring into the mirror, whispering something he couldn't hear. And though his anger burned, a flicker of pity stirred. But Daniel saw it and cut it down immediately. "Don't go soft, Dad. She earned this. Remember what she stole." By the end of the month, the Jennings house no longer felt like a home. It was a stage, each room heavy with tension. The tick of the hall clock sounded like a countdown. Margaret moved through it like a ghost, her eyes darting, her face pale. She jumped when the phone rang, when the mail slid through the slot, when Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. And the men, the father and son, moved with deliberate quiet, letting her imagination do half the work. Every silence, every sidelong glance, every unfinished sentence was another needle in her mind. The plan was working. But Daniel was restless. He wanted more. "This is just the beginning," he told Harold. "We've shaken her. Now we start taking things from her, one piece at a time. And that, my boy, is where this act closes. With Margaret broken at the edges, with Harold torn between anger and pity, and with Daniel sharpening his cruelty into something new. Because in the next act, they won't just unsettle her. They'll begin to strip her of trust, of dignity, of the small securities she clings to. Margaret Jennings was no longer the woman she had been when she made her confession. The house itself seemed to eat at her. Every silence, every glance between father and son, every small reminder that she no longer controlled her own place. But Daniel was not satisfied. His patience was razor-thin, his appetite for revenge sharp. He wanted not just her unease, but her collapse. One late evening in the garage, with the smell of sawdust hanging heavy in the air, Daniel laid out his next step. Making her nervous is child's play, he said, leaning against the workbench. It's not enough. She has to lose things. Things she thinks belong to her. That's how you break someone. Harold wiped his hands on a rag, watching his son carefully. What are you talking about? Money. Friends. Trust. Little by little, we'll strip her until she's left with nothing but us, and we won't be there for her either. Harold hesitated. He was angry, yes, but he wasn't a cruel man by nature. He still remembered the woman she had been when they were young, before all this. But Daniel cut across his thoughts. She chose this when she chose Grandpa over you. Don't forget that. And so Harold, still heavy with doubt, nodded. It began with Margaret's purse. One morning, as she showered, Daniel slipped inside the bedroom and removed a $50 bill from her wallet. When she discovered it missing later that day, she confronted Harold. Did you take money from my purse? She demanded, standing in the kitchen, her voice shaking. Harold looked at her flatly. No. Then where is it? Maybe you misplaced it. She glared at him, her breathing sharp. I know what I had. Don't lie to me. But he only folded his newspaper and turned the page. That night, Daniel returned the bill, placing it under the couch cushion where she might eventually find it. When she did 2 days later, she held it up with trembling hands. I told you I wasn't crazy, she said. Harold said nothing, but the look in his eyes made her doubt herself all over again. Daniel went further. He called Margaret's sister one evening from a payphone across town, disguising his voice. He told her Margaret had been having trouble, that she was forgetful, that she wasn't herself. Within days, her sister phoned the house, speaking in careful tones. Maggie, are you doing all right? You sound different lately. Margaret's face crumpled. Different how? Just tired. Distracted. Maybe you should see someone. Margaret hung up in tears. Daniel, sitting in the living room with his father, pretended to overhear. She's starting to notice, huh? And Margaret, clutching the phone, could only stare at them with wild eyes, realizing the walls were closing in. Meals became a battlefield. Harold and Daniel would speak in half sentences, exchanging glances, leaving Margaret desperate to know what they meant. Did you take care of it? Daniel would ask. Yes, Harold would reply shortly. Margaret's fork would freeze midair. Take care of what? But they would not answer. One evening she slammed her fist on the table, plates rattling. Enough! You're tormenting me on purpose. I know it. I can feel it. Daniel leaned back, his voice calm. If you feel guilty, that's your problem. Not ours. She stared at him, her face pale, and whispered, You're not my son. He smiled coldly. You're right about that. At night, Harold lay awake, listening to his wife's muffled sobs from the other side of the bed. There were moments, brief, flickering, where his anger softened into something else. Pity, maybe. A memory of the young woman she once was, before betrayal had poisoned her. But Daniel's voice always came back to him. Don't go soft, Dad. She earned this. And Harold, torn between rage and compassion, chose silence. Margaret's grip on herself began to falter. She misplaced keys, forgot appointments, burned dinner twice in a week. She looked over her shoulder constantly, as if expecting to catch the two men whispering behind her. One afternoon, Harold found her in the hallway, staring at her own reflection in the mirror, whispering, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. I'm not. She didn't see him standing there. And for the first time, Harold felt a chill, not of anger, but of fear. Not for himself, but for what they were making of her. Daniel saw it differently. He saw weakness, and weakness excited him. She's collapsing, he told his father with quiet satisfaction. Now it's time to take something bigger. Something she can't get back. What do you mean? Harold asked, his voice low. You'll see. Daniel's eyes gleamed with the hunger of a man who had found his purpose in cruelty. And Harold, weary and uncertain, realized he had unleashed something in his son he might no longer control. Margaret had grown fragile. She barely left the house anymore, afraid of the looks, the silences, the sense that everything around her was slipping. She had dark circles under her eyes, her hair gone dull, her body moving slower, as if every step weighed double. But Daniel wasn't satisfied. "She's already broken," Harold muttered one evening, staring at his hands. "Maybe that's enough." Daniel leaned forward across the table, his eyes burning. "No, Dad. Not yet. She took 30 years from you. She needs to feel that loss herself. We haven't even begun." And so, the first real strike was planned. Margaret kept a savings account she never spoke much about, modest, a small nest egg she had guarded for years. Harold knew of it. Daniel learned of it by watching her one afternoon as she scribbled numbers in her checkbook. "She thinks that money is her safety," Daniel said. "Take it from her, and she'll have nothing left." At first Harold resisted. "It's hers. She saved it herself." "So what?" Daniel shot back. "Did she respect what was yours when she went to bed with your father? This isn't about money, it's about showing her there's no escape." And so, late at night, father and son went together to the bank. Harold signed the withdrawal form with a steady hand, though his stomach twisted. $7,200, every last cent. They didn't spend it. Daniel locked it away in a metal box in his closet. The point wasn't to use it. The point was to leave Margaret with the sudden emptiness. It took her 3 days to realize. The morning she did, Harold found her sitting at the kitchen table, the bank slip trembling in her hand. Her face had gone white, her lips pale. "It's gone," she whispered. "All of it. Every cent." Harold poured himself coffee. "Maybe you miscalculated." Her eyes snapped up at him, furious and terrified. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare talk to me like I'm losing my mind." "I know what was in that account." Daniel walked in just then, as though on cue, and leaned against the counter. "Then maybe you should ask yourself where it went." Her chest heaved. "You did this. Both of you. You're trying to destroy me." Daniel's smile was thin and merciless. "Aren't you already doing that yourself?" That night, Margaret ransacked the house. She tore through drawers, closets, cabinets, muttering to herself as she searched for the missing money. Harold sat in his chair, listening to the thuds and crashes. When she came downstairs hours later, her hair tangled, her hands trembling, she pointed at him. "You think I don't see it? The two of you whispering, watching me, taking things from me. I'm not blind. I know what this is." Harold rose slowly, his face hard. "It's what you earned." Her knees buckled. She sank into a chair and wept, her sobs raw and hollow. And still, Daniel watched with satisfaction. Daniel's cruelty didn't stop there. Margaret had been invited to a friend's birthday party across town. Desperate for some normalcy, she dressed herself carefully, even applied makeup for the first time in weeks. But as she reached the door, Harold stood in her way. "Where are you going?" "To Linda's party," she said, her voice fragile but hopeful. I need to see people. To feel human again." Harold's silence stretched. Then he said coldly, "You don't deserve friends." Her face crumpled. She left anyway, but Daniel followed her in his car, parking where she couldn't see him. He waited until she stepped inside the house, laughter and warmth spilling into the night. Then he called Linda's husband from a burner phone. "You should know," he said in a low voice. "Margaret has been saying ugly things about your family. She's been unwell." The call was short. When Margaret entered the party, she found the atmosphere cold, distant. Conversation stopped when she approached. Smiles were forced. Within an hour, she left, humiliated, returning home with makeup streaked by tears. Daniel was waiting. "Rough night?" he asked casually, as though he hadn't orchestrated it himself. She shoved past him, retreating to the bedroom. Harold sat alone in the kitchen after she fled upstairs, staring into the darkness. His hands trembled against the table. He could still hear her sobbing faintly through the walls. "This isn't who I am," he whispered to himself. But then another voice whispered back, the memory of her confession. Your father. The anger returned, and he clenched his fists. Upstairs, Margaret lay curled on the bed, whispering, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy. I'm not. And Daniel, in his own house, lay awake with a smile on his face. The savings account was gone. Her friends had turned cold. Her confidence was shattered. But Daniel was restless still. He told his father the next day, We've heard her, yes. But we haven't finished. The next step is bigger. Public. Something that makes her the fool in everyone's eyes. Harold felt a chill. What do you mean? Daniel's smile was cold. You'll see. Jennings' home had grown darker by the day. Margaret drifted like a ghost, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed, moving from room to room as though hunted. Harold said little. Daniel was restless. His cruelty demanded more than whispers and stolen bills. She still thinks she has dignity, he told his father one evening in the garage. The bulb overhead flickered, painting the air in uneven light. We've taken her money, her friends. But people still see her as Margaret Jennings, wife, neighbor, respectable woman. We need to rip that away too. Harold shifted uncomfortably. She's already breaking. Not enough, Daniel snapped. His eyes burned with a hunger that unsettled even his father. We make her a spectacle. Let everyone see her weakness. Then she'll finally know what it feels like to carry shame in public, the way you carried it in silence for 30 years. The anniversary dinner. The opportunity came with their wedding anniversary. 35 years. Margaret, desperate to claw back some normalcy, suggested a dinner out at a quiet restaurant on the edge of town. Maybe it will help us reset, she said, her voice thin, almost pleading. Harold only nodded. Daniel encouraged it. He insisted on joining, claiming he wanted to celebrate them as a family. Margaret hesitated but agreed, her need for reconciliation outweighing her suspicion. The restaurant was warm, candlelit, the murmur of other diners filling the air. Margaret dressed carefully, wearing a necklace Harold had once given her long ago. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a flicker of hope. But Daniel had already set the trap. The reveal. Halfway through the meal, while Margaret tried nervously to keep conversation light, Daniel rose from his chair. I'd like to make a toast, he said, lifting his glass. Other diners turned slightly, their attention caught. Margaret's eyes lit with cautious relief, thinking perhaps her son had softened. Daniel's voice was clear, carrying across the room. To my mother, he began. Who, 30 years ago, decided her vows didn't matter. Who thought it was fine to betray her husband with his own father. The words hit the air like a thunderclap. Margaret froze, color draining from her face. Glasses paused midair at nearby tables. Conversation stilled. Harold sat motionless, staring down at his plate, letting the silence stretch. She confessed it. Daniel went on, his tone casual, almost amused. Kept it buried for 3 decades. Imagine that. 30 years of lies at the dinner table, in this very marriage. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's hands trembled against the tablecloth. Daniel, stop, she whispered, her voice breaking. But he did not stop. So here's to my mother, he finished coldly. The woman who taught me that family means nothing, that secrets matter more than love. Congratulations, Mom. Everyone knows now. He sat down slowly, savoring the stunned silence that followed. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes darted to Harold, begging for rescue. But he said nothing. She pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs scraping loud against the floor. Her necklace caught on the edge of the table and snapped, beads scattering across the restaurant tiles. She didn't stop to pick them up. She fled, nearly stumbling as she rushed out the door. Aftermath. Harold found her later that night sitting on the edge of their bed, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. How could you let him do that? She asked, her voice hoarse. Why didn't you stop him? Harold stood in the doorway, the light behind him casting his shadow long across the floor. "Why didn't you stop yourself 30 years ago?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. And then she broke, collapsing into sobs so deep they shook her entire body. Daniel's triumph. Meanwhile, Daniel was exultant. "She's finished," he told his father the next morning. "Everyone knows. She can't walk into town without feeling their eyes on her. We've taken her past and dragged it into the present. She'll never escape it now." Harold said nothing, but his stomach churned. He saw the wild look in Margaret's eyes, the way she clutched her own arms as if holding herself together. He had wanted justice. But what they had given her was something darker. Still, when he remembered his father's face, stern, cold, victorious even in death, the anger hardened again. He told himself she deserved it. Margaret's silence. The house grew quieter still. Margaret stopped answering the phone. She no longer cooked meals. She stayed in the bedroom most of the day, curtains drawn. Once, Harold caught her standing barefoot in the yard in the middle of the night, staring blankly at the trees. When he called her name, she didn't answer, as if she hadn't heard. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were hollow. "You've taken everything," she said softly. "So what's left?" He couldn't answer. Daniel's final plan. It was Daniel who supplied the answer. "There's one more thing to take," he said, his voice low, almost gleeful. "Her place here. She still clings to this house, this marriage, as if they're hers. But they're not. We'll drive her out. Make her leave with nothing." Harold felt a shiver. "And then?" "Then we'll be free," Daniel said simply. But Harold, for the first time, wondered if freedom was really what awaited them, or just another kind of prison, built out of cruelty and silence. It had been weeks since the restaurant, weeks since Margaret Jennings' name had become something muttered in town with pity or derision. Neighbors no longer waved when she walked past, friends answered her calls with clipped tones, and her sister had begun speaking to her as though she were unwell. The Jennings home itself had grown like a coffin, quiet, airless, each room holding more memory than life. Margaret wandered through it, thin and pale, wearing the same worn cardigan most days. She muttered sometimes when she thought no one heard. At the sink she whispered to herself, at the mirror she mouthed words, at night she prayed aloud in broken sentences Harold never answered. Harold sat in his chair most evenings, watching her from the corner of his eye. Some nights he thought he almost saw the girl she had once been, the bright laughter from long ago, the woman he'd chosen before any betrayal had touched them. Other nights he saw only his father's shadow standing between them. And Daniel came and went often, with the sharp smile of a man who felt triumph rather than doubt. "She's finished," he told his father in the garage one evening, smoke curling from the cigarette he held. "She's got no money, no friends, no dignity left. But there's one last piece to take." Harold looked at him warily. "What's that?" Daniel's eyes glinted. "This house. Her place in it. She thinks these walls are hers. We'll drive her out. Tonight." Harold felt his gut twist. It wasn't hesitation over the plan. Margaret had betrayed him 30 years ago, and her confession had shattered what little peace he had left. But there was still something about the finality of it, about turning her into a wanderer with nothing. "She won't survive it," he muttered. Daniel's answer was flat. "That's not our concern." The words hung in the cold air of the garage, echoing in Harold's chest. He thought of his father, stern, controlling, unforgiving. He thought of Margaret's broken voice the night she confessed. He thought of Daniel's eyes, glittering not with justice but with cruelty. And at last Harold nodded. They found her in the living room that night, sitting on the sofa, the lamp casting yellow light across her tired face. She was staring at the blank television, hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel didn't waste time. He stood tall, his voice carrying authority. "Pack your things. You're leaving." Margaret blinked slowly, as though the words reached her through water. "What?" "You heard me. This isn't your home anymore." Her lips trembled. "This is my house." My marriage. My life. I gave 35 years here. Daniel stepped closer, voice cold. You poisoned it the day you slept with Grandpa. You don't belong here. You never did. Her face twisted in pain, but she turned toward Harold. Her eyes, once sharp, now hollow, still carried a shred of pleading. Harold. Tell him no. Tell me this isn't what you want. The old man's throat tightened. For a moment he saw her as she was long ago, when they were young, when she had smiled at him across the dance floor. For a moment he wanted to stop it all. But the memory of his father's face, the memory of her confession, rose inside him like fire. His lips moved, and his voice came out flat, final. It is. The light went out of her eyes. She rose slowly, as if every bone in her body ached. Without another word, she climbed the stairs. They heard the small sounds of drawers opening, a suitcase closing. When she came down, she carried only a single case. She paused at the door, rain glistening on the glass. Her voice was quiet, almost broken. You've killed me without laying a hand on me. And then she stepped into the night. The door closed softly behind her. Daniel exhaled as if relieved. It's done. She's gone. We're free. But Harold stood in the doorway long after, staring at the wet street where she had vanished. His chest felt heavy, not light. The house was quieter than ever. No footsteps overhead. No muttered prayers in the kitchen. No sound of dishes being set on the table. Just silence. At first Harold told himself this was peace. That he had taken back what was stolen. But the silence grew heavier each night, pressing on him, filling the rooms with ghosts. He remembered her words, "You've killed me without laying a hand on me." And worse, he remembered Daniel's face, the cruel satisfaction in his son's eyes. One evening, Daniel came by, smiling, almost gloating. She's out there somewhere, probably begging on a couch. Don't think about her. She's nothing now. You've won. Harold stared at his son, and for the first time he understood the truth. Margaret had betrayed him once, decades ago. But Daniel had betrayed him too. He had turned Harold's pain into cruelty, had fed his grief until it became poison. The victory was hollow. The house was hollow. He himself was hollow. Margaret was gone, his father dead, his son corrupted by vengeance. And Harold, he was left with nothing but silence, a chair by the window, and a question that would gnaw at him until his last day. Had he punished her? Or had he damned himself?